For decades, that old barn stood quiet, just dust, hay, and the weight of forgotten years. But when the farmer struck metal beneath the floorboards, he didn't just find a vault. He opened a door to a secret buried for generations. What he uncovered next shook the whole town. Stay with this story. The truth hidden under that barn is darker and far more valuable than anyone ever imagined. Stick around. This story will change the way you see ordinary people forever. Before we begin, if stories of quiet courage, unexpected love, and everyday miracles speak to your heart, consider subscribing. One click helps us bring more of these true-to-life inspirations into the world, and we're so grateful to have you with us. Now, let's begin. The sun didn't rise so much as it crawled over the prairie that morning, casting a pale gold across the flat stretches of Ellis County, Oklahoma. The light filtered through the cracks in the weathered wood of Walter Harlan's barn like it had done for over 50 years, quietly, without asking for attention. Walter was already awake, not that he ever really slept anymore. Sleep had become just another chore after Clara died, another thing he did out of habit, not need. He stood by the kitchen window, holding a chipped mug of black coffee, watching the dust swirl gently in the sunlight. A tractor sat motionless by the edge of the wheat field, a relic even older than the hands that once operated it. The farmhouse creaked when the wind blew. It wasn't haunted in the Hollywood sense, but the ghosts of memory lived there freely. Clara's quilt still hung on the back of the couch, her embroidery threads tucked neatly in a tin box above the stove. Walter hadn't touched them, hadn't dared. That box held her smell longer than any photo ever could. He stepped outside into the cold morning, boots crunching over gravel. The barn loomed in the distance like a tired sentinel. It leaned a bit to the east now. Too many storms, too few repairs. But it stood, same as he did. The hens clucked low as he tossed feed, and the air smelled of dry hay and stubbornness. He moved slowly, but not aimlessly. Every step had its rhythm, its purpose. Walter had run this land alone for 19 years. Not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know what else to do. The only son he ever had, Danny, had left in anger over a decade ago. "You care more about this dirt than your own blood," the boy had shouted before slamming the truck door and disappearing down the road. Walter had stood in the same spot for nearly 5 minutes after, watching the dust settle and the world go quiet again. He never called, neither did Danny. The sky turned sour by mid-afternoon. Clouds boiled over the horizon in the west, thick and dark and fast-moving. Walter watched them gather as he leaned against the barn door. Oklahoma storms didn't arrive with much warning. They came like bad news, loud, sudden, and often mean. That night, the wind screamed through the wheat like it was mourning something. Thunder cracked the sky in two, rain lashed against the farmhouse windows, and Walter sat by the fireplace, unmoving, waiting it out like he always did. He didn't pray, not anymore. Clara used to. She said storms were God's way of checking in. Walter just figured God had forgotten this part of the country. Sometime around 3 a.m, there was a sound, different than thunder. It was more like a groan, a deep, tired groan. Then a crash, not loud, but heavy, final. When the storm passed and the morning light finally arrived, wet, weak, and unwelcome, Walter made his way to the barn. The smell of damp wood and crushed earth met him before he even reached the door. One entire corner of the barn had collapsed. The roof had caved in, beams twisted like broken ribs, hay scattered everywhere. A sinkhole had opened just beneath the north side, swallowing part of the floorboards. Walter stood at the edge of the hole, frowning. He didn't curse. Clara used to hate that. But he sighed, deep and slow. He fetched a lantern and a shovel. At 73, climbing into a hole wasn't exactly smart, but stubbornness often won out over sense. The mud sucked at his boots as he lowered himself into the hollowed ground. It was darker than expected down there, but the lantern cut through the shadows well enough. He scraped aside a layer of dirt and splintered wood, expecting old piping or maybe forgotten tools. What he uncovered instead stopped him cold, steel. Not rusted fence wire, not a septic tank lid, a flat, cold slab of steel embedded beneath the barn's foundation. Its edges were precise, manufactured. He cleared more debris, heart thudding now, not from exertion, but from something else, something older. He hadn't felt this kind of stirring in decades. Etched into the center of the steel plate was a faded brass emblem, circular in design. Letters ringed the edge. Jefferson National Trust, established 1921. Walter crouched there for a long time, hand resting on the cold surface. The lantern hissed softly beside him, its light catching dust motes in the still air. He didn't know what it was, not exactly, but he knew one thing for sure. This didn't belong here, and it sure as hell wasn't part of any barn he'd ever built. The wind had gone quiet outside, so had the birds. And for the first time in years, Walter Harlan wasn't thinking about chores or weather patterns or the ache in his knees. He was thinking about what the land had been hiding from him all along, and why, after all these decades, it had finally decided to show him. The morning after the storm, Ellis County woke up to fallen tree limbs, busted fences, and power lines drooping like tired shoulders. But over at the Harlan place, something else had been stirred loose, something older than any storm could conjure. Walter stood at the edge of the sinkhole, the smell of damp soil and splintered wood hanging heavy in the air. The steel plate he'd uncovered in the middle of the night was still there, half covered in mud and hay. He brought a crowbar this time. A man who spent 50 years with his hands in the earth tends to have the right tool for every kind of stubborn. The metal groaned as he worked at the edges, prying loose warped boards and rusted nails. His hands trembled, not from age, but from anticipation. A lifetime of routine had dulled his nerves. Now they sparked again. After nearly an hour of digging, brushing, and muttering to himself, Walter managed to reveal the full panel. A set of faded hinges lined one side, and what looked like a recessed hand grip sat in the center. It wasn't just a plate, it was a door. He exhaled hard. "Well, Clara," he whispered, "this ain't what I expected to find under your tomatoes." He gave the handle a tug. Nothing. Locked tight. Typical. Back in the house, he rummaged through an old cabinet, dug past duct tape, bullets, and a half-used bottle of iodine, and came up with a rusted iron ring holding a collection of keys, some of which hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. An hour later, soaked in sweat and mud, the latch finally gave. The door groaned open, stiff and loud, like it was waking from a 50-year nap. A waft of air escaped. Old, dry, but somehow charged with memory. Walter lowered the lantern slowly into the opening. A set of stairs descended into darkness. He hesitated for only a moment before climbing down. Wood steps gave way to concrete, then tile. It was cooler underground. The space was no bigger than a root cellar, but the walls were lined with metal file cabinets, shelves stacked with ledgers, bundles of cash, and, most peculiarly, a locked steel case, labeled in bold red ink, "Confidential Federal Holdings." He didn't touch that just yet. Instead, his eyes landed on a dusty wooden shelf, holding a reel-to-reel tape recorder. A handwritten label on one of the reels read, "Case 917, do not play," which of course meant he had to. He carried the recorder and tape up to the house, wiping the dust off with a rag soaked in whiskey. He hadn't used one of these machines since the 70s, but once he set it up on the kitchen table and clicked the wheel into place, his hands knew what to do. The machine whirred to life with a soft hiss and crackle, then silence, then voices. Not a conversation exactly, more like pieces of one. Men speaking in coded phrases. Transfer complete. Chicago end confirmed. Schedule set for March. Trust must remain silent. You know the consequences if this leaks. The landowners won't be able to trace it. Case 917 is locked. No copies. Walter leaned in, his coffee untouched. The voices weren't clear, but they had weight, authority. The kind of tone used by men who weren't used to hearing no. One voice, gruffer than the rest, said something that froze the old farmer cold. Oklahoma families won't miss what they never knew existed. The tape clicked off. Walter sat there in silence, heart thudding like a war drum. He stared at the wall, where Clara's embroidery hung, "Faith is not seeing, but knowing." He whispered, "What the hell did I just find?" The rest of the day passed in a haze. He didn't eat, didn't go into town. He went back into the vault once, just to stare at that confidential box like it might start talking. It didn't. That night, the storm winds returned, not outside, but inside him. As he lay in bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, one thought wouldn't let him go. If someone buried this, what were they so afraid of someone finding? He didn't sleep. Couldn't. Not anymore. The roads to the Harlan farm hadn't changed much in 20 years. Still narrow, still dusty, still winding through wheat fields that bowed in the wind like they were tired of standing tall. The sky hung low, heavy with late spring humidity, and something else, something unspoken. The kind of tension that settles in when a door that was slammed shut years ago finally creaks open again. Danny Harlan hadn't seen his father since the day he left, 11 years and a few months. Not that anyone was counting. He remembered how the dust had kicked up in the rearview mirror of his truck back then, how the house had grown smaller in the distance, and how silence filled every inch of space between him and the man he couldn't understand. The farmhouse looked older now, smaller somehow. The paint had faded from white to the soft gray of resignation, and the roof sagged just slightly at the eaves, like it had given up trying to hold itself together. The fields were still planted, still neatly cut and worked, but the life around them seemed thinner, worn down. Danny parked beside the barn, stepped out, and stretched his legs. He was leaner than he used to be, and the city had softened the edges of his voice, but something about the place made his posture instinctively straighten. The land had a way of demanding respect, even if you'd turned your back on it. Walter Harlan stood on the porch, arms crossed. He hadn't changed much. A little more stooped, a little more gray, but his expression was the same, distant but alert, weathered like the land he'd never left. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them had matured into something both of them understood. It wasn't anger anymore, just history. The barn loomed quietly behind them, its damaged frame covered in a makeshift tarp. Walter motioned toward it with a nod, then turned without a word. Danny followed. Inside, the air was thick with dust and damp hay. The scent of storm-soaked wood lingered in the broken beams. Walter led him to the sinkhole, now partially boarded over, and gestured toward the exposed steel door. Danny crouched beside it, brushing away some of the remaining dirt with the edge of his boot. His fingers traced the words etched into the brass. Jefferson National Trust, established 1921. The emblem was faint, but official-looking, too official for anything that should be buried under a private barn in rural Oklahoma. They descended into the vault without speaking. The concrete stairs echoed underfoot. Danny took it all in slowly. The rows of rusted filing cabinets, the dusty shelves, the cash bundles yellowing at the corners, and most of all, the locked steel box labeled Confidential Federal Holdings. He paused near the back wall, his hand resting on a ledger. The room felt like a time capsule, untouched, sealed with intent. Something about it disturbed him, not just because of what was there, but because of what it meant. Things didn't get buried this deep unless someone wanted them forgotten. Back in the house, as the afternoon sun sank low over the wheat, Walter placed a tape recorder on the kitchen table. The old reel whirred to life, the audio crackling to fill the silence with the voices of dead men. The words were cryptic. Federal code names, banking terms, warnings. Danny sat still, his gaze distant as the recording ended. The names meant something to him. He'd read them before, in obscure footnotes and buried archives. He just never expected to hear them whispered on a tape in his father's kitchen. Outside, a hawk circled the field. The barn stood like a wounded animal, broken but breathing. Inside, the two men sat across from each other, not as father and son yet, but as two men caught in the same current, suddenly pulled into something much older and deeper than either had expected. Danny reached for one of the files and opened it with deliberate care. Names, land deeds, payout records, rejected claims, signatures from officials whose ink had dried before he was born. It wasn't just evidence. It was an accusation, quiet, buried, and damning. As he read, he didn't speak. Neither did Walter. The distance between them was still there, but something had shifted. There was purpose now, a shared weight. Whatever silence had stood between them for all those years wasn't gone, but it was no longer empty. Evening came slow and heavy. The sky bled orange over the fields as Danny stood on the porch, arms resting on the railing. He looked out over the rows of wheat that had once seemed endless to him as a boy. He remembered running through them, breathless, dirt on his cheeks, chasing nothing and everything. Behind him, the house glowed dimly with the soft yellow of kitchen light. The tape had been replayed twice more. The ledgers were stacked on the table. The vault remained open, like a mouth daring them to speak its secrets aloud. He knew now this wasn't just about old money or forgotten history. Something darker had been buried, something bigger. And his father, this man he thought he'd left behind, had been sitting on top of it the whole time. Danny didn't know what they were supposed to do next, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to figure it out alone. By Monday morning, the stillness of Ellis County had started to bend under the weight of whispered questions. It began, as it always did, at the feed store. Hank Raleigh noticed Walter buying a second-hand bolt cutter and a case of industrial lubricant. He didn't think much of it, until he saw the older man slip a lockbox into the back of his truck, tuck it beneath a faded tarp, and drive off without saying more than 2 words. Walter wasn't one for conversation, but something in his silence was louder than usual. Then came the hardware store. Walter bought a battery-powered reel scanner, 3 packs of archival gloves, and requested heavy-duty concrete sealant, none of which lined up with tractor repair or irrigation prep. Mavis Harper, behind the counter, made a mental note of it. By the time Walter left the parking lot, she'd already texted her sister, who ran the library. By mid-afternoon, the rumors had found their way to the diner on Main Street. Coffee steamed beside half-eaten pie as the theories grew legs. I heard he found a treasure map. No, government gold, buried under his barn, like Fort Knox, but smaller. I bet it's drug money. That's why his boy came back, sniffing around. You remember that big storm? That's when it all started. Nobody had facts, but in a town like Ellis, truth didn't spread as fast as belief. Out on the farm, Walter felt the shift like wind before rain. The air had a new edge, the kind that told a man he was being watched, even if he couldn't prove it. The first real sign came Tuesday, just after sundown. A black SUV sat parked down by the old Miller Creek turnout, half a mile from the Harlan fence line. Danny spotted it on his way back from photographing old land records. The vehicle didn't move. No headlights, no plates. He didn't mention it to his father right away, but when he found a drone tangled in the east fence line the next morning, its rotors still spinning faintly, camera lens cracked and blinking, he knew it was no longer a story buried in paper. Someone was listening. Walter didn't react when Danny placed the drone on the kitchen table. He just stared at it for a long moment, then poured another cup of coffee. "This is bigger than I thought," Danny said quietly. Walter nodded once. "They know." They didn't say who they were. Neither had to. The next knock on the door wasn't from a neighbor. It came Wednesday afternoon, soft but firm, like someone who'd been told exactly how many times to rap before sounding too eager. Walter answered, already sensing trouble. The man wore a crisp button-down, pressed slacks, and a name tag that read, Clay Bishop, Regional Land Inspection Services. His handshake was practiced, his smile, polite to the point of emptiness. "I'm checking on storm damage reports," he said. "Just routine. FEMA's looking at support requests from this area." Walter stared at him. "Didn't file one." "Well, sometimes reports come through third parties, just making rounds." Danny appeared on the porch, holding a ledger in his hand. His expression didn't hide suspicion. Clay's eyes flicked to the book, then back to Walter. "Mind if I take a look around the barn?" Walter didn't answer. He simply stepped aside, letting the silence say what he wouldn't. Clay walked slow, surveying. His eyes weren't on the roof or the foundation. They were scanning deeper, measuring the soil line, looking for entrances. He didn't ask questions. He just absorbed. When he left, he smiled again. "Beautiful piece of land you got here. Not many like it left." Walter didn't smile back. He just watched the SUV pull away, gravel crunching beneath tires that knew they'd be back. That night, the power cut out. Not from a storm, not from equipment failure, just darkness. The house went silent at 2:17 a.m. Danny checked the breaker, everything intact. 10 minutes later, the power surged back, lights flickering unnaturally. Walter didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, shotgun across his knees, waiting for movement that never came. By Thursday morning, half the town had turned cold. Walter stopped at the gas station and received no greetings, no small talk, just eyes that darted away too quickly. Danny overheard a clerk mutter, "Should have kept it buried." Even Linda, the librarian, who had once known Clara, closed her blinds when they drove past. Whatever lay beneath the barn wasn't just a secret. It was a weight pressing down on the community itself, something that had long been whispered but never proven. And now that it had surfaced, old alliances were fraying. Back at the farm, Danny sat in the vault alone, flipping through the names in one of the ledgers. He highlighted surnames that matched street signs in town: Morrison, Carter, Bishop. The same Bishop. He paused. The ledger noted a transfer of funds in April 1933, marked Emergency Land Liquidation, Unresolved, and initialed CB. He took a photo and emailed it to a backup account, one only he knew about. Outside, Walter stood near the barn, smoking for the first time in years. The wind had picked up, but it carried no relief. He felt it in his bones now. This was no longer about what had been found. It was about what would be done with it, and whether a man like him, old, tired, mostly forgotten, still had a say in anything that mattered. The ground under his boots was the same dirt he'd planted every spring since he could walk, but now it felt like a stranger, like something beneath the surface had begun to stir, and it wanted out. The sun rose late behind a thick curtain of prairie fog. From the kitchen window, the wheat field looked more like the ocean, gray, endless, and hiding more than it revealed. Walter stood there quietly, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug, watching nothing in particular. He hadn't spoken since the night the power flickered like a warning. In the vault, Danny worked under the dim light of a camping lantern, the low hum of an extension fan pushing air through the narrow stairwell. His hands were dirty, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the ledger in front of him was older than either of them. Dates from 1932, seals faded, corners torn. The deeper he read, the stranger the picture became. This wasn't just a deposit vault. It was a ledger graveyard. Inside, the faded pages were land deeds, some stamped with forfeited federal transfer, others signed by names that echoed faintly in local cemeteries. Most of them had one thing in common. They were tied to loan defaults during the Dust Bowl, but the numbers didn't add up. Danny circled 2 entries, one for a Reed McAllister, whose entire 480-acre ranch was seized in '33 with no recorded foreclosure notice, another for a Ruth Livingston, whose trust fund vanished during the same month a new oil lease appeared under her land. He flipped to the next file and found a document with shaky cursive, sealed in a tin envelope. The paper inside was brittle, water-stained, and handwritten. July 9th, 1932. If anyone ever finds this, know I tried to speak up. I was part of it. Not proud. They made us hide the money. Said it was for the good of the region. That banks were failing and people couldn't be trusted to decide what to do with their own land. But they didn't save the farms. They saved themselves. Tell the truth if you ever can. If it still matters by the time you read this. M.G. Whitcomb. The name meant nothing to Danny at first, until he connected it to a signature he'd seen on a 1933 oil consortium approval. Whitcomb wasn't a clerk. He was a chief loan officer for Jefferson National Trust. Danny sat back, letting the weight of it sink in. It was all bigger than a vault full of old cash. This was a map of coordinated economic manipulation, land seized under false defaults, redistributed to political allies, and funneled through banks that quietly vanished before any investigation could follow. Walter entered the vault behind him, footsteps slow but steady. Danny handed over the note. The old man read it twice. His fingers tightened around the edge. "They stole from their neighbors," Walter said finally. "Took land while these people were starving." Danny nodded. "And buried the proof under barns like yours." For a long while, neither spoke. The lantern hummed. Outside, a crow cawed from the fence post, but its cry faded fast. Later that day, Walter drove into town for feed and parts. He took the long road in, past the Morrison place, past the shuttered Cotton Gin, past the spot where Clara once planted a row of wild sunflowers. At the hardware store, Folks still stared, but the silence had shifted. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was tension, like everyone was waiting for something to crack open. Old Joe at the counter wouldn't look him in the eye. "You hear anything about a federal matter?" Walter asked casually. Joe shrugged. "Heard a lot of things lately. Mostly folks saying you should leave well enough alone." Walter didn't answer. He bought what he needed and left. On his way out, he saw Clay Bishop's black SUV parked across from the cafe, idling. He didn't stop. Back at the house, Danny laid out the documents across the dining table like puzzle pieces. He began to sort them by name, location, and dates, building what looked like a chain of events too coordinated to be chance. He marked Ellis County, Roger Mills, Beckham. The pattern was clear. Each property had one thing in common. It sat on or near potential mineral deposits. Walter hovered behind him, arms crossed. That why they took Clara's cousin's farm? Danny checked the file. Same month, same seal. He never had a chance. The old man said nothing. His jaw worked like he was chewing through history. Danny's voice was quieter now. "This isn't just a family thing, Dad. If we're right, dozens of people had everything stolen from them. Generations gone because someone lied on a form." "And what do we do?" Walter asked. Danny paused. "We either bury it like they did, or we start digging in the open." Walter looked toward the barn, the tarp still fluttering at the edge. "What if digging costs more than it's worth?" Danny didn't answer. That night, they found tire tracks by the south fence. Deep, recent, and unfamiliar. They followed them out to the edge of the property, where a patch of dry weeds had been flattened. Walter spotted a cigarette butt, unfiltered, burnt short. Not a local brand. No footprints, no vehicle in sight, but someone had been watching. Danny returned to the vault, scanned the documents into encrypted files, and emailed them to 2 colleagues from grad school, people he trusted. He left out the exact location, but included enough context to raise eyebrows. If something happened to him or Walter, at least the truth wouldn't die in the dirt. The last file they opened that night was sealed inside a small leather-bound journal. It belonged to someone named Raymond E. Crenshaw, a minor banker in Elk City during the Depression. His writing was frantic, each page more desperate than the last. "They told us to mark only white families with recovery codes. The rest were called unsalvageable. We protested. They promoted someone else. I tried to resign. The next day, I was reassigned to land assessment. I saw what they did. They stripped whole families of land, sold it before the ink dried. This vault was one of several drop points. No records, no fingerprints." Walter closed the journal slowly. "They built this off people's bones." Danny nodded. "And now it's up to us to decide whether to uncover the skeletons." The Cadillac came just before dusk. A deep blue DeVille, long and low, rolling down the county road like it had all the time in the world. It didn't belong, not on this dirt, not in this light. But there it was, clean, quiet, and crawling to a stop outside the Harlan farmhouse, like a memory that had taken form. Walter watched it from the porch, one hand resting on the back of a worn wooden chair, the other gripping the railing. He didn't move. The air had that dry stillness to it, the kind that wrapped around your ribs and held its breath. The car door opened with a soft click, and out stepped a man who looked like he knew things he never had to say out loud. Slim suit, dark shoes, sunglasses, even though the sun was sinking. He walked like someone who didn't need permission, just space. He didn't introduce himself right away, just took a slow look at the fields, the barn, the house, and finally, Walter. "Beautiful property," he said. Walter didn't answer. He didn't nod either. He just watched. The man smiled politely, as if that were enough. "Name's Clay Bishop. I believe we met briefly the other day during my inspection." Walter still didn't respond. Bishop took off his glasses. His eyes were sharp, a little too pale, like winter sky through frost. "There's a lot of history in this part of the state. You start digging too deep, you never know what you might wake up." It wasn't a threat, not directly, but it wasn't small talk either. Walter let the silence stretch. Clay adjusted his cuffs. I'm just here to offer a little advice. Some things are meant to stay buried. What you found, it's the past. You stir it up. It won't change what's already gone. Walter finally spoke. Maybe not, but it might change what comes next. Clay smiled again, this time tighter. Old land like this, Mr. Harlan, it's delicate. Once the ground opens up, it's hard to put it back the way it was, especially if someone's standing in the way. He looked at the barn, then back at Walter. I'd hate to see something happen to it, or to anyone. He turned without waiting for a reply, slid into the Cadillac, and disappeared down the road as quietly as he'd come. That night, the wind changed. It rolled over the wheat in uneven gusts, and the trees behind the house creaked with unease. Danny stayed up late, eyes flicking between the ledgers in his laptop screen. He had uploaded most of the documents to a secure cloud server. The files were heavy with history, lined with betrayal. Sometime around 2 a.m., Walter woke to the smell of smoke. At first, he thought it was the fireplace. He hadn't used it since the first frost, but the scent was wrong, acrid, oily, and getting stronger. He threw the covers back, rushed to the front door, and saw it. The barn was on fire. Orange tongues of flame licked up into the night sky, casting shadows across the field like writhing ghosts. The tarp had already vanished, consumed by heat. Flames danced along the roofline, chewing through wood older than most people in town. The dry air fed it like it had been waiting for just this kind of anger. Danny ran from the back of the house, barefoot, shouting. They called the fire department, but everyone knew what the response time was like out here. 20 minutes, best case. The barn wouldn't last 10. They grabbed what hoses they had, buckets too, but it was hopeless. Embers rose into the sky, carrying pieces of history with them. The barn, Clara's quilt pattern still tacked to the rafters, the mark on the beam where Danny hit his head as a boy, the smell of decades of harvests, was dying. And yet, the vault didn't burn. It stood beneath the ruined structure like a defiant secret, its steel frame blackened but unbroken. When the fire crews finally arrived, there wasn't much left to save, just smoldering beams and a floor of scorched dirt. The fire chief walked the perimeter, shook his head, and muttered something about accelerants and too fast to be natural. But there was no official cause, no footage, no proof, only suspicion. The next day, Walter sat on the back steps, eyes fixed on the ashes. The coffee in his mug had gone cold an hour ago, but he hadn't noticed. Danny stood beside the vault, staring into its hollow shell like he could see the ghosts inside. They both knew. This wasn't just about papers and money anymore. It was about control, about silence, about power buried so long that people had stopped believing it was real. Now it had surfaced, and someone wanted it covered again, permanently. Danny finally broke the silence. They're going to come back. Walter didn't answer, didn't nod, but the way his fingers tightened around the mug said enough. They're not just watching, Danny continued. They're warning us. That fire was a message. Walter stood slowly. Then we better decide what to say in return. That night, they took shifts keeping watch. Walter sat with the shotgun again, rocking slow on the front porch. Danny moved files to more secure locations, backed them up to multiple servers. He drafted a message to an old college acquaintance, Linda Grace, now a regional journalist with a nose for buried corruption. He didn't send it. Not yet. But he stared at her name for a long time. The wind howled through the empty barn frame, and something in the sound carried a promise. This wasn't over. Whatever truth the vault held had teeth, and it had begun to bite. The fire hadn't even cooled before the whispers started again. This time, they weren't about gold or hidden riches. They were about secrets, and what Walter Harlan might be hiding beneath the scorched bones of his barn. In Ellis County, fire had always meant loss. Fields, homes, sometimes even lives. But this fire was different. It didn't destroy so much as reveal. The vault beneath the barn still stood, blackened at the edges, but defiant, unmovable, unexplained, and now, unmistakably, real. Walter spent the morning walking the property line with the same quiet concentration he'd once used to inspect harvest rows. Only now, he wasn't looking for dry patches or signs of blight. He was looking for tire marks, footprints, evidence. Proof that someone had come in the night and tried to silence something too large for a single family to carry alone. Danny, meanwhile, sat at the dining room table, files spread across the surface like battlefield maps. The journal from Whitcomb, the ledgers, the confession from Crenshaw. They had enough to tell a story, but stories, he knew, didn't matter unless people listened. And people didn't listen unless someone with a microphone said the words out loud. He pulled up his contacts and typed the name. Linda Grace. She wasn't a national name, not yet. But she'd built a reputation for digging through the kind of red tape that others ignored. She'd grown up 2 counties east, daughter of a soybean farmer who lost everything during the drought in '95. She understood loss and legacy. Danny typed the message carefully. No melodrama, just facts. Vault discovered under barn. Documents indicate systemic land theft and fraud in the 1930s. Physical evidence intact. 2 generations affected. 1 fire already. Need eyes and truth on the record. He hesitated, hovered over the send button, then clicked. Linda arrived less than 24 hours later. She didn't bring a camera crew, just a notebook, a rugged backpack, and a recorder she kept in her pocket. Her boots were dusty within minutes of stepping out of the car. Danny met her at the edge of the property. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, just looked at the ruins of the barn, then at the steel door still visible beneath the ash, and nodded once, like she'd expected it to be exactly this. Inside the house, she listened quietly as Danny laid out what they had. No embellishments, just a slow unfolding of the evidence. Walter sat to the side, arms crossed. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was like stone dropping into still water. They thought folks out here wouldn't notice, he said, and even if we did, they figured no one would believe us. Linda jotted notes, eyes flicking between them. When she stepped into the vault, she froze for a moment. The air was cool, still, unnaturally so. She ran a hand along one of the ledgers, looked at the sealed Federal Holdings box, and then back at Danny. You understand what this is, don't you? She said. He nodded. Buried history, institutional theft, a cover-up spanning decades. No, she said. It's bigger than that. This is provable. She opened her notebook. I'm going to write it. That afternoon, while Linda recorded interviews and photographed documents, Danny noticed something odd in the corner of the vault. A line of condensation along the baseboard. Too uniform, too straight. He ran his hand along the concrete and felt a faint seam. He called Walter over. Together, they pulled back the shelving unit, revealing what looked like a second wall. Poured concrete, but not original. Newer, smoother. They cleared tools, shelves, boxes. Linda knelt beside it. Could be a chamber behind this, a second vault. Danny stared at it. Or something meant to be forgotten twice over. They found the breaker to the old pump room behind the barn and rerouted power to the vault. Walter brought in a masonry saw. The sound echoed through the ground like a bone being cut. It took 4 hours to break through. Behind the wall was another room, smaller, deeper. Inside were crates stamped with the emblem of the U.S. Marshals. Dust coated everything, but not as thick as the main vault. This one had been entered more recently, not decades, maybe years. Danny pried open a crate. Inside, faded documents labeled Operation Clayroot. Top folders read Asset Seizure Compliance, Region 4, Media Containment Protocols. Distribution, Memos, Petroleum Recovery Fund. Linda froze mid-note. Clayroot? She asked. That's a ghost name. Whistleblowers mentioned it in Senate memos in the 70s, but it was always redacted. Danny lifted a file labeled Collateralized Land Retention, Private Trusts. It confirmed it. Ellis County had been used as a testbed for covert asset recovery. Land was seized not for debt, but for strategic reserve, oil, water access, control of migration patterns. Walter sat on a crate, staring at the walls. They didn't just rob us. They rewrote the story. Linda stood and took a photo of the sealed box with her phone. This has to go public, Danny agreed. It starts with one article. 2 days later, the story ran. It wasn't flashy. Just a headline. Did rural Oklahoma hide America's greatest financial cover-up? But the content landed like dynamite. Within hours, the post had been shared 10,000 times. By morning, it trended on social media with the hashtag "The Vault Under the Farm." Former residents, descendants of displaced families, even ex-bank workers began commenting. Some shared their own documents. Others told stories that echoed Walter's discovery. News vans appeared at the end of the Harlan driveway by the third day. Clay Bishop didn't, but Danny knew better than to think they were in the clear. Walter watched the coverage on an old TV in the living room, the volume low. His hands were still, eyes unreadable. "We've stirred up the whole hornet's nest," Danny said. Walter didn't look away from the screen. "Good. Maybe it's time they stung someone else for a change." Outside, the wheat field swayed in the wind, just as it always had. But now, the land carried a different weight. A truth long buried now pushing its way to the surface. The article changed everything, but not the way Danny expected. In the first 24 hours, praise flooded in, from strangers, from across the country, even overseas. Academics, journalists, amateur historians, and descendants of Dust Bowl families reached out to thank him and Walter. Emails came with attachments, photocopied deeds, yellowed family letters, old photographs of farms that looked hauntingly familiar. But from Ellis County itself, there was silence. And then the cold came. Not the kind that shows up in the air, creeping in under the doorframe. No, this kind of cold was personal, measured in glances that used to linger, but now slid past like rain on a windshield, in conversations that ended the moment a Harlan walked into the room. It was a turning of backs, quiet but brutal, and far more punishing than threats ever could be. At the gas station, the pump still worked, but the attendant didn't. Walter stood inside for 5 minutes before anyone acknowledged him, and when they did, it was with a nod so mechanical it could have come from a machine. The change was exact. No eye contact. No, "Take care now." No, "How's the wheat this year?" Danny stopped by the library one morning to look at archived maps. The door was locked, not from the inside, from a new deadbolt he hadn't noticed before. A hand-lettered sign on the glass read, "Closed for private event." He could see 3 people through the window. None of them looked up. Linda tried to interview townspeople. She asked simple questions about land history, about local memory, about rumors of buried files. Most refused to speak. A few agreed, but only off the record, and even then, their eyes darted nervously toward unseen corners. One elderly woman, Nora Pruitt, a retired nurse, pulled Linda aside outside the pharmacy. "You should leave it alone," she whispered. "They already came for my grandfather once. He had proof. And then the papers were gone. So was he, a few months later. Stroke, they said, but he was strong, never sick a day in his life." Linda asked who they were, but Nora just shook her head. "Doesn't matter. You don't fight the roots when they run that deep. You cut the leaves and pretend the tree's clean." She turned and disappeared into the alley before Linda could respond. At home, Walter returned from town one afternoon, carrying a brown paper bag that had been tossed onto the ground outside his truck. Inside, a dead chicken, feathers soaked in red paint. Across the bag, someone had scrawled in shaky handwriting, "This land's cursed because of you." He didn't show it to Danny. He just buried it near the back fence and kept it to himself. That same night, Linda's car was vandalized. The tires slashed, windshield cracked. A single word etched in the hood with something sharp. "Liar." Danny found her standing beside it in the driveway the next morning, arms crossed, jaw tight. She didn't say anything for a while, just stared at the damage like it was an old friend she hadn't expected to see again. "They want silence," she said finally. Danny nodded. "Then they picked the wrong farm." The deeper they dug, the more pushback they faced. Danny uncovered property records that contradicted public claims, land that had supposedly been sold or abandoned during the 1930s, but now sat beneath oil fields managed by shell companies with names recycled from generation to generation. One name kept appearing, Bishop Equity Holdings, the same surname as Clay. Linda traced the trail further and found an old court record sealed in 1974, a state settlement involving redirected mineral rights tied to one of the vault's deeds. It had been handled by a junior attorney in Tulsa. Clay Bishop's father. The connection wasn't legally damning, but it was symbolically loaded. When Linda tried to reach out for comment, she got no response. But the next day, her apartment in Tulsa was broken into. Nothing stolen, just papers moved, her laptop unplugged, her mattress flipped. Message received. Back at the Harlan farm, Walter stood on the porch most nights, rocking slowly, shotgun always nearby. The wind had changed. It no longer carried the scent of dirt and wheat. Now it smelled like sweat, like pressure. Danny began to see it in his father's face, something harder than fear. It was the same look Walter wore when the hail came too early, or when coyotes broke through the chicken wire. It was the face of someone who'd accepted the fight before even knowing what it would cost. "Are we doing the right thing?" Danny asked one night. Walter didn't answer right away. He spit into the dirt, rubbed his hands together. "I don't know," he said, "but I know what happens when you do nothing." That was enough. In the days that followed, the town's coldness turned sharper. The church where Clara's funeral had been held refused to take Walter's offering envelope. The feed supplier stopped answering their calls. Even Danny's old baseball coach, now a retired mechanic, wouldn't meet his eyes when they crossed paths at the post office. But amidst the frost, small flickers of warmth survived. A note appeared on their porch one morning, left under a jar of blackberry preserves. In clean cursive, "My grandfather lost his land in '34. I've heard the stories. Don't stop. L. H. Another came by email. We always wondered why our great-uncle never came back. Now we know. We're with you. Keep digging." They weren't alone, but they were outnumbered. As the chapter closed, the wind picked up again, stronger this time. It rattled the windows, bent the wheat, brought with it the sense that someone, was moving closer. Walter closed the vault door that night for the first time, not to hide it, to protect it. And for the first time in decades, he bolted the kitchen door behind him. It wasn't a courthouse, not in the traditional sense. Just a squat red brick building wedged between the Ellis County Records Office and the old feed co-op. The floors creaked when you walked, and the air smelled like paper that had never been allowed to breathe. There was no metal detector, no marble steps, just dust, silence, and the weight of decades pushing in from every corner. But on the morning Walter Harlan stepped into that room, it might as well have been the Capitol. He wore a clean shirt, white starch, the collar a little too stiff, and boots polished just enough to still look like they belonged in the field. Danny walked beside him, eyes forward, jaw locked. Linda followed, notebook tucked under her arm, press badge clipped to her collar like a flag carried into battle. The courtroom held maybe 30 people, but it felt full, not because of bodies, but because of eyes. Every one of them, watching, measuring, judging. Town council members sat near the front, bank representatives, county clerks, even Reverend Mullins, who hadn't looked at Walter since the article went live, occupied a seat by the wall, arms crossed, tight across his chest. And across the aisle, seated at a polished oak table, were the men in suits. 3 lawyers from Oklahoma City, imported, expensive, and silent, except for the rustle of leather portfolios. Their briefcases bore the gold initials of Bishop Equity Holdings, even if they refused to say the name out loud. They weren't there for a trial, not yet. This was a motion hearing, just a procedural step, a question of whether Walter and Danny could be granted a temporary injunction to prevent demolition, sealing, or government repossession of the underground vault and its contents until a formal investigation could be conducted. In theory, it was simple. In practice, it was war. The judge was an old man named George Latham, a quiet sort, known for quoting scripture more than statute. He'd lived in Ellis County his entire life, presided over more land disputes than criminal cases. On most days, he ruled with an easy hand, but this day, his face held something sharper, more alert. Danny presented their case, calm, deliberate. Exhibits were entered, vault photos, deeds, financial documents, Linda's article, Walter's statement, printed and signed. The suits countered with language sharp as thorns. Illegally retained property. Unsubstantiated historical conspiracy. Private excavation on agriculturally zoned land. Defamatory implications without evidence. They argued that the vault, while real, was not subject to preservation protections. that the land had changed hands too many times for any single family to claim legal standing, that publishing allegations tied to defunct institutions was irresponsible and harmful to community trust. Danny held his ground. We're not asking for a verdict, we're asking for protection, temporary custody of historical artifacts until a full review can be done by independent experts. The room stirred, papers shifted, coughs masked murmurs, and then the judge looked at Walter. "Mr. Harlan," he said slowly, "I don't usually require personal statements in hearings like this, but this land is yours. Your name is on the deed. Your family worked it. Tell me why it matters." Walter stood. The room seemed to still around him. He didn't read from notes, didn't look at Danny, just out at the window behind the judge, where the sunlight hit the wheat field beyond town. "I'm not a fancy man, Your Honor. Never was. I wake up early. I check my fences. I plant when it's time, and I pray when I remember to. This land's fed me, clothed me, broke me, and healed me more times than I can count." He paused, breathing deep. "But this vault, this thing under my barn, it ain't just metal and paper. It's what they took from people like me, folks who couldn't fight back, folks who trusted banks and churches and neighbors and got dust for it in return." His voice thickened, not with emotion, but with gravity. "I ain't asking for pity or money. I just want the truth left where it can be seen, not buried again, not wiped clean by folks who don't know the names on those ledgers. People died with that weight on their hearts. I won't add to it." Silence, heavy, full. Then Judge Latham leaned back, folded his hands, and closed his eyes for a long moment. The ruling came 20 minutes later. Motion granted. The vault was to be sealed under court protection. All excavation or removal was to cease immediately. An independent historical investigator from the state would be assigned. Temporary custody of the contents would remain with Walter Harlan under supervised review. It wasn't a victory, but it was a stand, and that was enough, for now. The fallout came fast. Within an hour of the ruling, local reporters called Danny's cell. Linda's inbox overflowed with interview requests. State archivists reached out. A university from Norman offered assistance with document preservation, but not all attention was welcome. That night, a dead calf was found at the edge of Walter's field. No branding, no tag. A message carved crudely into its flank. "Bury it again." They didn't call the sheriff. There was no point. Instead, Walter and Danny buried the animal under the old pecan tree out back, same place Clara's dog had been laid to rest years ago. It felt wrong, but right was in short supply. Later, as evening wrapped the farm in silence, Linda sat on the porch beside Walter. The vault glowed faintly beneath a tarp, cordoned off and guarded by a motion sensor Danny had installed that afternoon. "You spoke like a man who knew the words for a long time," she said. Walter stared at the horizon. "Didn't have the words till someone else gave me the reason." She nodded. "People are going to remember that speech." "I don't care if they do," he said. "I just care that they remember why it had to be said." Inside, Danny clicked through a map of archived land transfers from the 1930s. A new name appeared. Rogers Keene Investment Group. Another shell, another lead. He bookmarked it, took a breath. The courtroom had bought them time, but not peace. And in places like Ellis County, truth cost more than silence ever did. They came at dawn, not with sirens or armored trucks, but with file boxes, scanners, and men in windbreakers bearing crisp gold lettering. FBI, National Archives, Department of Justice. The convoy rolled up the gravel driveway like a storm front, silent, unrelenting, and federal. Walter was already on the porch. He didn't say a word, just tipped his hat slightly and stood aside. He'd known this was coming, not because someone told him, but because secrets, once unearthed, have a way of pulling everything toward them like gravity. What he hadn't expected was the number of them. 5 vans, 2 unmarked sedans, a box truck from the Smithsonian Artifact Recovery Division. Danny met them near the vault. He held a thick binder of photocopies and backup drives, already labeled and indexed. Linda stood nearby, camera ready, not for clicks, but for record. This wasn't just history anymore. It was evidence. The vault door opened for the last time under Walter's control. From this point forward, The government would take over. The lead archivist, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Elise Morales, stepped into the chamber with gloves and quiet reverence. She moved not like someone looking for treasure, but like someone tending to the wounded. Her team followed, unfolding tables, setting up lights, scanning each page with the same care a surgeon uses on living flesh. Hours passed, crates were opened, files were cataloged, and then they reached the second vault, the one behind the concrete. Inside were the clayroot files, stacked neatly, numbered, and coded in ways even Danny couldn't untangle. Dr. Morales raised her head. "This isn't just about land," she said. "This is structural." Operation Clayroot, it turned out, had been more than an experiment. It was a prototype. The files confirmed what Danny and Walter had suspected, but the reality was worse. During the Great Depression, a coalition of private banks, state officials, and federal advisors formed a covert program designed to control migration, redistribute natural resources, and secure land assets critical to post-depression economic recovery. They called it preservation. But the method was theft. Landowners were selected based on political vulnerability, race, and economic status. Their holdings were seized under fabricated defaults, their names erased, and the land transferred to holding companies connected to lobbying firms and investment syndicates in Chicago, New York, and Houston. Most of the families never knew. Many of them vanished into poverty, displacement, or silence. Walter sat beside the vault, hands clasped. "And they buried it in my barn." Dr. Morales glanced at him, respectful. "Not buried, entrusted. Someone left this here on purpose. They didn't want it forgotten. They wanted it found." That evening, Walter gave his first interview. He didn't want to, but Linda insisted gently. The networks were calling, people were asking questions, and if Walter didn't speak, someone else would. So he sat on his porch, as he always had, the late sun setting behind him, camera lights warm against his weathered skin. A national morning show aired it live. He spoke slowly, carefully. "This land raised me, but it also kept quiet about things no one should have forgotten. We didn't ask for this vault, but now that it's here, I reckon it's ours to carry. Not for money, not for glory, for justice." By noon, he was a sensation, a reluctant one. Back in the house, Danny stared at the influx of messages, requests for interviews, speaking engagements, lawsuit inquiries, even a call from a senator's office. He ignored most of them, but one message stood out. A museum director from Kansas wrote, "We've had families for years ask about lost farms, missing deeds, old letters that made no sense. Now they do. What you found, it connects them all." Danny leaned back in his chair, the weight of everything settling deeper. It was real now, not just a story, not just dust. Outside, Walter stood near the vault one last time before the government sealed it with official lock and code. It would remain on his land, but under federal protection. Not gone, just watched. A small plaque would be placed beside it. Jefferson Vault, 1921 to 1933. Contents recovered April 2025. Evidence in historical investigation of federal land seizure and financial misconduct, in memory of those whose names were nearly erased. Walter read it twice, then turned back toward the house. Later that night, Linda joined them for dinner. No cameras, no questions, just chili and cornbread and the soft hum of summer insects. Afterward, she handed Danny a flash drive. "These are the digitized files from today. I made copies before federal intake. You should have them." Danny nodded, a quiet thank you. She hesitated. "You realize this is just the beginning, right? Lawsuits will follow. Counterclaims, maybe denials. What you've done here, it's going to spread." Walter looked up from his coffee. "Let it." At the edge of the wheat field, the wind picked up again, brushing through the stalks like fingers turning pages. The land was still the same, but now it remembered differently, because the men who tried to hide the truth had built their walls with stone and lies and silence. But they'd forgotten one thing: stone cracks, and once the cracks begin, they run all the way to the light. The letters started trickling in by the second week, handwritten, typed, scribbled on legal pads, scanned in from old nursing homes, mailed from P.O. boxes and law offices across the country. Some were simple: Others went on for pages, but they all said the same thing in different words. We thought it was just our family. Descendants of farmers, laborers, war veterans, widows. Names once scribbled in forgotten ledgers, now rising up from the dirt, with voices strong enough to shake the silence. For every stolen deed inside the vault, there seemed to be a living soul still carrying the loss. Danny spent hours each day sorting through the correspondence. He created a master spreadsheet: names, counties, years displaced, types of theft. Some came with photos, black and white images of grandfathers in coveralls, houses that no longer stood, faded birth certificates, and bank statements with red, foreclosed stamps. Some letters had been written decades earlier, never sent, tucked into drawers, kept as ghosts. Now, they had a destination. The legal system responded slower than the mail. Class action lawsuits were filed in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri. Survivors and their descendants petitioned for hearings. Some cases moved forward. Others stalled behind walls of red tape and immunity statutes. But the tide was turning. The Clayroot files were undeniable. Depositions were taken. Congressional inquiries launched. A subcommittee was formed to review rural land seizures between 1928 and 1943. Historians, economists, archivists, and families alike were summoned to testify. In the midst of it all, Walter made a quiet decision. He wouldn't rebuild the barn the same way. Not this time. Instead of timber and shingles, he used the payout from the initial court settlement to construct a new structure, a hybrid of barn and museum. A place not to store wheat or tools, but memory. It rose slowly, steel-beamed, modest in size, but sacred in intent. Inside, each panel told a piece of the story. A scanned confession from Reginald Crenshaw, enlarged and mounted under museum glass. Copies of land deeds marked invalidated in the 1930s, now stamped restored. Photographs of displaced families, their names recovered through cross-referenced census rolls and bank logs. A map of Ellis County, layered with red string and brass pins, tracing the spread of Clayroot from a single barn to 24 other counties. And in the center, under soft yellow lighting, stood a replica of the vault door, its heavy steel cracked open just enough to remind visitors, truth can be sealed, but not silenced. Linda returned to help curate the space. By then, her article had gone national, syndicated in over 40 publications. A book deal followed, along with interview requests from every major network, but she turned most of them down. She preferred the stillness of Ellis County now, preferred the work of restoring stories more than retelling them for entertainment. At Walter's request, she helped organize an event, the Day of Reckoning and Return. On a bright Saturday morning in October, over 300 people gathered on the Harlan property. Tents lined the fields, folding chairs stretched toward the horizon. Farmers, pastors, school teachers, grandchildren of the forgotten. Each carried a photo, a folder, or simply a name. Danny opened the ceremony with a short speech. History didn't forget you. It was forced to. And today, we choose to remember. Then came Walter. He walked to the front, slowly, boots kicking up dust in the same soil where truth had once been buried. He wore a navy vest, sleeves rolled, hands trembling slightly with age, but voice steady. This land gave and it took. It raised crops, and it raised questions. And now, finally, it's giving back. Not because of laws, not because of money, but because we chose to listen. He looked over the crowd, people wiping tears, clutching photos, nodding quietly. For a long time, we were told to move on, that it was just the way things were. But some things, you don't move on from. You move through them. And if you're lucky, you carry something out the other side worth passing on. The barn-turned museum was open that afternoon. Visitors moved through slowly, reverently. Children touched the steel vault replica. Elders wept beside the display of forgotten deeds. Danny stood near the guest book as one woman signed her name, then paused, eyes glassy. My grandmother always said we lost our land in a storm, she said. Turns out the storm wore a tie. Danny nodded. Now it has a name. Outside, Walter sat under the pecan tree, the same one where Clara's dog and the dead calf lay buried, the same tree that had outlived them all. He listened to the laughter, the footsteps, the distant hum of stories finding voices. Linda sat beside him. "You started something you won't live to see the end of," she said. Walter smiled faintly. "Most things worth starting work that way." That evening, as the sun dropped behind the wheat again, Walter and Danny walked the fence line side by side. It had become a ritual, a quiet check of what remained and a reminder of what had changed. They stopped near the back field. "Think she'd be proud?" Danny asked. Walter didn't answer right away. He just looked out across the land, still gold, still waving like it always had. But now it felt full again, whole. "She'd say it took me long enough," Walter finally said. They both laughed, not loud, but real. The porch creaked with every sway of the rocker, a sound older than memory. Walter Harlan sat in his usual spot, elbows resting on the arms of the chair, worn smooth by decades of weather and habit. The sky was the soft kind of blue that only came at the edge of autumn, where summer clung to the edges of the light but didn't have the strength to stay. Out in the distance, the wheat moved again. Always the wheat. Not in grand waves, like some romantic painting, but in subtle, rhythmic motion. Like it was breathing. Like it was listening. The barn stood proud now, reborn not as a place to store feed or oil-stained tools, but as a house for stories. Visitors still came, sometimes in small groups, sometimes alone. They never stayed long, just long enough to walk the rows of photos and names, to run a hand along the replica of the vault door, to sign the book near the exit with whatever words they could summon. Some wrote entire paragraphs, others just signed. Some left nothing at all save for silence and a hand pressed to glass. Walter liked to sit outside and listen to them come and go. He rarely spoke to anyone directly anymore. He didn't need to. His time for telling had passed. Now, it was the land's turn. Danny had moved back for good. He'd turned down the university offers, the think tank positions, the book deals. Said he didn't want to talk about the past if he couldn't touch it with his hands. He kept the farmhouse in working shape, tended the wheat, and ran educational tours through the museum on weekends. In his spare time, he helped families piece together their lost histories. He'd built a searchable database online, gave presentations at local schools, taught kids how to read old land records and census maps. He called it the Root Ledger Project. Walter had only ever seen one presentation. He sat in the back, hat in hand, watching his son click through slides of black and white photos and audit trails. And when a teenage girl in the front row asked, "How come we didn't learn about any of this before?" Danny simply replied, "Because it was meant to stay buried." But now, it wasn't. The mornings stayed quiet, just the way Walter liked them. He woke early, even when he didn't need to, made coffee the way Clara used to, black, strong, bitter enough to bite. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her lavender oil, though he hadn't touched the bottle in years. One morning, Danny found him sitting at the table with an old envelope in his hands, Clara's handwriting on the front, to be read only when the work is done. Danny didn't ask how long he'd had it. He just sat beside him, waited while Walter opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, her handwriting, still graceful, still firm. "Walter, if you're reading this, then you've finally finished what I always knew you'd start. You held too much in for too long, love. Not just grief, but truth. And truth has weight. But it also has wings. Let it fly now. You've done enough. Let the land breathe again. Let yourself rest." Clara Walter didn't cry, but he closed his eyes for a long time. That afternoon, he walked the field one last time, his boots sinking softly into the earth he'd spent his life tending. He stopped halfway down the row, where the wheat curved just enough to hide the house from view. The wind picked up gently, brushing through the stalks, and he could have sworn he heard Clara's voice, not words, just presence, like a hymn humming through the stems. He sat there for hours, letting the sun fall around him, letting the shadows stretch long. And when he returned, he didn't look back. Walter passed quietly 2 weeks later, in his sleep, no pain, no fear, just a long, slow exhale that felt more like surrender than departure. Danny found him in the rocker, blanket folded over his lap, the letter from Clara still held in one hand. There was no funeral per Walter's request. Instead, they held a harvest dinner on the property. Potluck, fiddle music, handshakes, and old stories. Someone read a passage from the Book of Amos. Linda gave a short speech. Danny didn't speak at all. He just stood beside the plaque outside the vault, ran a hand over the engraved words, "Truth grew here." In time, people stopped calling it the Vault Story. They started calling it the Harlan Revelation. Professors published papers. The museum gained national accreditation. More land was returned to families. Some won compensation, others just won closure. Both were victories, but Ellis County stayed the same in the ways that mattered. The gas station still had 2 pumps. The hardware store still didn't sell anything fancy. And if you came through during wheat season, you could still spot a man in boots walking the fence line, carrying the past in one hand and a future in the other. Usually, it was Danny. Years later, Linda narrated a documentary that aired nationwide. She ended with these words. In the heart of Oklahoma, where wind bends wheat and silence runs deep, a man once found something no one believed existed. A vault, a story, a truth hidden beneath generations of dust. But it wasn't the gold or the files that changed the world. It was a farmer who chose not to bury it again. And sometimes, when the air was just right and the wind moved low, the fields seemed to whisper, not with voices, but with echoes. Because what was once buried in shame had finally bloomed into something sacred. And in that quiet corner of the prairie, truth had found its way home.